Have you ever noticed how some people desperately want love, but the moment it gets too close, they pull away? How they crave connection, yet somehow sabotage the very relationships they prayed for? Maybe that's you. Maybe you've spent years wondering why relationships feel so exhausting, why trust feels dangerous, why a simple text message can trigger anxiety, why silence feels like rejection, why affection feels suspicious, why commitment feels suffocating, and why no matter how much someone loves you, a part of you still expects them to leave. If this sounds familiar, the problem may not be your relationship. It may be the invisible blueprint you were given long before you ever entered one. Because childhood trauma doesn't stay in childhood. It grows up with you. It follows you into friendships, into romance, into marriage, into every conversation where vulnerability is required. The cruel paradox is this. The survival strategies that protected you as a child become the very things that sabotage intimacy as an adult. The emotional armor that once kept you safe becomes the wall that keeps love out. As a child, hyper-awareness protected you. As an adult, it creates anxiety. As a child, emotional distance prevented disappointment. As an adult, it prevents connection. As a child, self-reliance was survival. As an adult, it becomes isolation. The child who learned that people are unpredictable becomes the adult who struggles to trust. The child who learned that love must be earned becomes the adult who never feels worthy of receiving it. And perhaps the saddest part is that many trauma survivors don't even realize they're carrying these patterns. Because when you live with something your entire life, it doesn't feel abnormal. It feels like you. It feels like your personality. That it feels like your nature. But what if many of the struggles you blame on your character are actually adaptations? What if the behaviors you call flaws were once brilliant survival mechanisms? And what if healing begins the moment you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What happened to me?" Imagine a house built on unstable ground. At first, the structure appears normal. The walls stand. The windows shine. Everything looks functional. But beneath the surface, tiny cracks begin to form. Years later, those cracks spread through every room. Relationships affected by childhood trauma work much the same way. The foundation was built during the earliest years of life. When we are children, our brains are not merely collecting memories. They are building models. Models of safety. Models of love. Models of trust. Models of self-worth. Psychologists call these internal working models. These mental blueprints become the lens through which we interpret every future relationship. If caregivers were consistently supportive, the child learns, "I am safe. I matter. People can be trusted." But if caregivers were neglectful, abusive, unpredictable, or emotionally unavailable, a different lesson emerges. Love is unstable. My needs are burdensome. People leave. I must protect myself. One of the most common consequences is something known as hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is a heightened state of alertness developed in dangerous or unpredictable environments. The nervous system becomes like a security guard who never leaves their post, always scanning, always anticipating threats, always preparing for disaster. The problem is that the brain cannot always distinguish between past danger and present safety. So even in healthy relationships, the nervous system remains on high alert. A delayed text becomes evidence of abandonment. A disagreement feels like rejection. A change in tone feels like danger. Another powerful concept is attachment theory, developed by psychologist John Bowlby. Attachment theory explains how early relationships shape adult intimacy. Children who experience inconsistent care often develop anxious attachment. They become adults who fear abandonment and constantly seek reassurance. Others develop avoidant attachment. They learn to suppress emotional needs and rely only on themselves. Both patterns originate from the same source, a nervous system trying to avoid pain. Then there is emotional parentification. This occurs when children become responsible for the emotional well-being of adults. Instead of receiving care, they become caretakers. Instead of being children, they become emotional managers. Years later, they become adults who feel responsible for everyone's happiness. Adults who struggle with boundaries. Adults who believe love must be earned through sacrifice. None of these patterns are character flaws. They are adaptations. The brain did not malfunction. It adapted to survive. And survival often comes at a cost. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This is the tragedy of unresolved childhood trauma. Many people spend decades living inside patterns they cannot see, repeating emotional cycles they do not understand. At the core of trauma is an invisible grief. Not only grief for what happened, but grief for what never happened. The comfort that never came. The protection that never arrived. The reassurance that was never spoken. The childhood that should have existed, but didn't. This grief is difficult to explain because it lacks a clear funeral. No one mourns what was missing, yet its absence shapes an entire life. Many trauma survivors become experts at adaptation, experts at reading rooms, experts at anticipating needs, experts at disappearing themselves. They become whatever others require. Anything to maintain connection, anything to avoid rejection, anything to feel safe. But there is a terrible trade. They sacrifice authenticity for belonging. They trade their true self for acceptance. And over time, they begin forgetting who they actually are. Their greatest fear is often not failure. It is vulnerability, because vulnerability requires trust. And trust once led to pain. So they remain guarded, careful, controlled, even when surrounded by people who genuinely love them. The heart wants intimacy. The nervous system wants protection. And the battle between those two forces can last a lifetime. This is why seemingly simple experiences become emotionally complicated. Receiving love feels uncomfortable. Asking for help feels weak. Expressing needs feels selfish. Setting boundaries feels dangerous. Rest feels undeserved. Joy feels temporary. The trauma survivor often lives with an invisible expectation that something bad is about to happen, even during the happiest moments. Especially during the happiest moments, because peace feels unfamiliar, and the nervous system often mistakes familiarity for safety. Even when familiarity is painful, the effects become visible in countless ways, not because trauma defines you, but because survival strategies become habits. You might constantly seek reassurance from partners, not because you're needy, but because your nervous system fears abandonment. You might push people away the moment they get too close. Not because you don't care, but because intimacy activates old fears. You might become attracted to emotionally unavailable people, not because they're ideal partners, but because they feel familiar. You might struggle to set boundaries, not because you're weak, but because boundaries once threatened connection. You might over-explain yourself constantly, trying to avoid conflict, trying to avoid misunderstanding, trying to avoid rejection. You might become highly independent, refusing support, handling everything alone, not because you enjoy isolation, but because dependence once felt unsafe. You might feel responsible for fixing everyone, saving everyone, helping everyone, while secretly neglecting yourself. You might apologize excessively, second-guess every decision, fear being a burden, fear disappointing others, fear taking up space, and perhaps most importantly, you might mistake these patterns for your identity. You might believe, I am anxious, I am broken, I am difficult, I am too much, I am not enough. But these are not identities. They are coping strategies. And coping strategies can be unlearned. The first step is witnessing, not judging, not fixing, witnessing, seeing the pattern clearly, recognizing the connection between past and present, understanding that the adult reaction often belongs to a wounded child still seeking safety. Healing begins when self-blame ends. Healing childhood trauma is not about becoming a different person. It is about becoming who you were before survival became your full-time job. One powerful approach is inner child reparenting. This means learning to provide yourself with the safety, validation, and compassion that may have been missing. Instead of waiting for others to heal the wound, you begin becoming the source of care. Another powerful practice is shadow work, a concept deeply associated with Carl Jung. Shadow work involves exploring the hidden parts of yourself you've rejected, the vulnerable parts, the angry parts, the fearful parts, the needy parts, The parts you learned were unacceptable. Healing requires welcoming them back, not eliminating them, welcoming them, because wholeness is not achieved through perfection. It is achieved through integration, through accepting every piece of yourself. Healing also means choosing softness, not weakness. Softness, allowing yourself to rest, allowing yourself to receive, allowing yourself to trust slowly, allowing yourself to believe that safety is possible. This process is not linear. There will be setbacks, moments of fear, moments when old patterns return. That does not mean you're failing. It means you're human. The philosopher Lao Tzu wrote, "When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be." Perhaps healing is exactly that. The gradual release of identities built around survival, the courage to stop being who trauma required you to become, and the willingness to discover who exists underneath. Because the deepest truth is this: you were never broken. You were adapting. The anxiety, the distance, the people-pleasing, the hypervigilance, the fear, all of it made sense once. But what protected you yesterday may imprison you today. And healing begins when you recognize the difference. The goal is not to erase the past. The goal is not to become perfect. The goal is not even to be fixed. The goal is to become whole. To build relationships that are based on trust rather than fear, connection rather than protection, presence rather than survival. And if this message resonated with you, remember, your wounds are not your identity. Your coping strategies are not your destiny. And the child inside you deserves more than survival. They deserve peace. They deserve love. And most importantly, they deserve to come home to themselves.